Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the basic systems for keyframe animation. We're not going to be producing an animation, but we'll take a look at the tools that we can use to animate our objects, and also we'll take a look at how you can animate attributes of objects as well. The keyframe animation system in Maya is similar to most other 3D software packages, and it also does bear some similarities to the animation systems in other software packages such as After Effects or Flash. Although there are significant differences between them, you may find one or two little things here and there which sort of are a little bit similar. So if you've had any experience playing around with keyframe animation in other software packages, you might find some of that knowledge translates across somewhat. Okay, so just as a little example here, I've just got a little polygon sphere, and I've added a Lambert shader onto it and just changed the color to red. So that's really just the basic setup of this scene. So the first thing I want to do is just show you guys where you can adjust your frame rate. So basically your frame rate is how many frames of your animation play per second of actual watching time. So for every second that you watch, the frame rate is how many frames per second you're watching. So if you click on your little animation preferences down here, there's a couple of things in here usually I would change. It automatically takes us to the time slider preferences, and normally what I'll do is hit playback, update, view, all, and basically what that'll do is if you've got multiple viewports open at the same time, for example if you've got your viewport set up like this, setting this update view to all will make your animation play simultaneously in all 4 viewports. Otherwise it will only play in the viewport you've got selected. You can see here this little kind of grey line around this viewport, or if I click over here you can see it activates this one. So update view, I tend to go with all. Looping basically is how it's going to play the animation back. So when it's set to once, basically it'll play through the timeline and then stop at the end. When it's set to oscillate, it'll play forwards to the end, and then it'll play backwards to the beginning, and then forwards to the end, and so on. So it just plays back and forth over and over again. With continuous, it just plays and just loops. So when it gets to the end of the animation, it just loops back to the beginning and plays again. So it'll just repeat it all the time. Your playback speed, basically what you want to do is set that to real time, 24 frames a second in this case. You can set your playback speed by right clicking down here on the control, the playback control. So usually what I'll do is just right click here, go playback speed, and you can either set it to real time or play every frame maximum real time. The reason you need to set this is if it's set to play every frame free, it will play it as fast as the computer can handle playing it. So it's not actually playing it at the speed that you would watch the animation in when it was rendered. So you're not actually seeing the true speed of it when it's set to play every frame free. Alright, it has to be set to real time in order to read the actual frames per second setting that you're animating at. So the only other thing generally that I tend to do is go over to settings, and you can adjust the time rate here. Now it's important to do this before you start animating, really. Usually what I would tend to do is set it to 25 frames a second. So this is basically for television in Australia and other parts of the world. Film, obviously, you've got 24 frames a second, and NTSC is basically American television frame rate, so they run at a slightly higher frame rate in the States. So basically what you need to do is set your frame rate to whatever the required frame rate you'd be doing your job for, and the frame rates can vary depending on sort of what the actual 3D animation is going to be used for. You can see here as well, there's obviously all these other frame rate settings. You know, you can actually set it to very specific high frame rates. Okay, but generally speaking, I tend to go with 25 frames a second. This also makes it a lot easier to calculate. Basically, 4 seconds will be 4 times 25, which is 100. So, you know, you're kind of rounding out to sort of the nearest 25, which makes it a lot easier to calculate. Now, notice when I change that down here on the timeline, it's actually adjusting. It's kind of making an adjustment. So now my start frame is currently, or my current frame I should say, set to 1.04. And basically what it's done, it's worked out over the 48 frames indicated here that I have on my total timeline. It's working out the difference, that 1 frame a second difference between 24 frames a second, which was the original setting, and 25 frames a second. So you'll notice that it will do that by itself, but that's not going to make any difference. Now, generally speaking, if you've already done some animation and you change your frame rate or your time setting, you can tick the keep keys at current frame button or option, and it will stop your keyframes that you've already animated from kind of adjusting to the new time frame. So basically it'll keep them where they are based on the frame numbers. If you don't tick that, you change your frame rate, you'll find that your keyframes will actually end up in between. They'll end up being between frames. So, you know, for example, if you had a keyframe on frame 11 and then you adjust the time setting to something different, a different frame rate, you might find that that keyframe ends up on like 11.23 instead of on 11 or on 12, which isn't a massive issue, but sometimes, you know, depending on what you're doing, you might want to keep them on exact frames. So you can set your frame rate there. Okay, so let's take a look down here at the bottom of the screen where we've sort of already indicated we've got our timeline. So this is our timeline. We've got this range slider underneath here, and you can kind of drag that back and forth. And really all this is indicating is the part of the timeline here that's visible. So at the moment, I can see from basically frame 1 to frame 25. But if I slide this along, I can view higher frames further down the timeline that were kind of hanging off the end, per se. Now the numbers at the bottom here, this is the first frame on the timeline, and this is the last frame, or the end frame on the timeline. So you can see here I've actually got 48 frames on my timeline, but currently visible, I only have 25 frames visible at the moment. Now I can increase the number of visible frames by expanding this slider. You can do that by clicking on the little square at the end and dragging. So I can now see all, well, in this case 50 frames. Okay, it's adjusted itself. But you can also, if you set this lower again, if you double click on this range slider, it will expand out to the maximum number of frames on your timeline. And if you double click it again, it will jump back down to the more focused view with less frames. Now where this comes in handy is a lot of the time when you're adjusting your animations, you're creating keyframes and so on, you don't want to be working on the entire timeline depending on what you're doing. Sometimes you need to get a much kind of closer view on the timeline in order to be able to pick out specific keyframes or frames on the timeline, I should say. Especially when you're dealing with, you know, you'll find that a lot of your animations are going to have probably at least a few hundred frames, and the more frames you have in the timeline, the less frames are actually physically visible. So, like if I increase this timeline to say 5,000, you can see there that it's jumping up incrementally on here by 200 frames per indicator. So to go down and find a very, very specific frame, really, I'd have to either drag along here. You can type in the frame you want up here. So if I want to jump to, say, frame, say, 2550, I can type that in there and it'll jump my indicator. But sometimes it's just nice to be able to kind of zoom in and be able to see frames on either side. So you can see there, even zoomed in that closely, it's still going up by an increment of 10. So I've basically got 10 frames in between here and here. All right, but that's how it works. So this is the current frame you're on, just here. This is the total number of frames in your animation timeline. And this is the last or the end frame that's visible based on the slider. This is the start of your timeline, and this is the first frame that's visible on your timeline. So you can see down here it's at 2483. So if we went right down to here, we'd have 2483. And back up here, we've got 2763. And if we go to the end of the timeline, 2763. So these inner numbers here and here are basically the visible frames at the start and at the end. The outer numbers are the total frames on your timeline. Alright, so I'm going to reduce this. Basically, I'll probably just reduce this back down to 100. And I'm going to fix this up here. I'm going to set this to 1. And what we can do here is just grab this end square and just drag, and that'll just expand out. So what that's done is just kind of reset it back. So 100 frames at 25 frames a second is basically 4 seconds worth of footage. So basically what a keyframe does is it records the state of the object at a particular time on your timeline. So by the state of the object, what I'm talking about is position, rotation, scale, but also things like transparency, color, reflectivity, and so on. Basically, the attributes of the object can be changed between one frame on the timeline and another frame on the timeline, and that's essentially the whole basis of animation. It's basically just different states of that object, or different, positions of that object over time. So the first thing we need to do is select a frame on the timeline that we want our first state to be for this object. So I'm going to just use position for the time being. So let's say I want the starting position for the object to be on frame 18, and let's say I want that position to be here. So I've just used the move tool and moved this object into the position that I want it to be in. What I can do is come up to the translate values in my channel box. Now you can see up here at the moment, basically because I've just moved the object, the only values that have changed are the translates, okay, the position. So what I can do is, the first way I can create a keyframe is basically I can highlight the translates like this. I'm just left clicking and dragging down the list until all the translate options are highlighted blue. And then what I can do is right click and hold, and then come down to key selected. And what that'll do is create a keyframe indicated by the red text boxes here on the current frame that I have selected, which is 18. And you can see I've got this little red line. Okay, so that's my first keyframe. So basically what that's done is kind of recorded the position. In this case, it's recorded these values that are highlighted red at this time for the object, which is in this location. I can then move down the timeline to the frame that I want my second position to be in. And what I do is move the object to its next position, and then I create another keyframe. So I can right click again and hit key selected. Now you'll notice nothing changes up here again, because as soon as you've got one keyframe on your object, basically this highlights red, and it'll basically, these will stay red as long as there is at least one keyframe controlling these channels. So you won't notice any difference up here until you start keyframing more than the translation values. But you'll see down here we've got a little keyframe on frame 40 now. So if I just rewind that and then press play, you'll see the object move from the first position to the second position between frame 18 and frame 40. So that's really the fundamental, that's like the absolute bare, most basic fundamentals for animating objects. It's really just a case of creating those keyframes at the right time for the object from one position to the next. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens if we add more than just translate. So if I come back down the timeline, and this time I'm going to go, a few more frames past the last one. And what I want to have happen here is I want the object to move, but I also want the object to stretch. So I'm also going to grab the scale tool, and I'm going to stretch the object out like that and maybe flatten it down like that. Okay, so you can see now I've moved it since the last position, so I need to key the translates again in order to record this new position. But I also have changed the scale values. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens when I key these channels. So I'll just right click again and hit key selected, and then I'll highlight these ones as well, and I'll key those. Now you can key multiples at the same time by holding Control down and dragging on the extra channels. So you can select sort of more than three or more consecutive channels in a row. Basically what this does, so you can select more than so you can select multiple channels in a row and have channels in between that are deselected by holding Control and just basically dragging on the ones or clicking on the ones that you want selected. If you hold down Shift and do that, it will select all of the channels in between the two channels that you click. All right, so Control is basically for selecting multiples but skipping some. All right, so let's see what happens there. Now there's actually going to be an error here. You'll see there that the object is permanently flattened out. It's not actually changing shape. Okay, so even right down at the beginning, at this first frame, the object is flattened out. Now the reason for that is that we only keyframed the scale once. And because we set the scale to this kind of squashed version of the object here on frame 57, basically with no other keyframes changing the shape or the scale, it's basically staying like that throughout the whole animation. In order to get this to change shape, we have to actually set a keyframe beforehand in its original shape or its original scale. So if I come back down here to my previous keyframe, and I set the scale values back to 1, like this, and then I keyframe those two values again, what I'm doing is setting a keyframe here on 40 that says basically at frame 40 the object should be the same original size. And then as we translate across to frame 57, the object is starting to read the new keyframe for scale, where the object is squashed. So you can see you can keyframe multiple channels at once, but you have to remember that when you start adding in new channels that you haven't keyframed yet, you need to make sure that you remember to keyframe a starting keyframe at the object's original scale, for example. Okay. Now the same goes for any other attribute that you want to keyframe, whether it be translate, rotate, or scale, or other attributes. Okay, so don't forget, you always need sort of a starting keyframe for the current state for everything that's going to change, and then you need the ending keyframe for all the different attributes that you're going to change. A quick way of setting keyframes rather than selecting specific channels is to use the set key tool. or option, and the keyboard shortcut for that is S. So basically what I can do, let's say I want to change the object back to its original shape. I'll just pop it over here, and I'll set the scale back to 1, I should say. There we go. So I've got the object back its original shape. I've got it in a new position, and don't forget I'm further down the timeline now. In order to just quickly set a keyframe, I can just press S on the keyboard, and that will keyframe every single unlocked channel in the channel box. So it's a fast way of setting a keyframe, but it will add keyframes for channels that I might not want to add animation to, such as the rotate in this case. So just be aware that that'll basically keyframe everything that's unlocked. You can lock channels by right-clicking on them and coming down to Lock Selected, and then you can unlock them as well from here. And basically what that'll do is stop those channels from being modified or having keyframes added to them. Okay, the last couple of little things. In the current version of the software, the auto keyframe toggle button down here, this little key, is switched on. Older versions of the software, its default is off. What this does is basically, if you turn this on, as soon as you have a single keyframe for an object anywhere, it will automatically make keyframes on the timeline at the current time for channels that have already been keyframed. So, for example, I've already got rotation, I've got translate, rotation, and scale keyframed. Okay, so if I move down the timeline, okay, I've got no keyframe here at 81. If I change any of those values, so for example, if I move the object, you can see it automatically creates a keyframe down here. So this is a fast way of creating keyframes without having to press S or without having to, come up here and manually keyframe channels. But it relies on you having already created a keyframe for the channels, either by hitting S or by manually keyframing. So you need one keyframe for that to work. Okay, otherwise it doesn't do anything. So, I can rotate this around, and maybe scale it. Like that. So the result that we get there is when we drag through the timeline, you can see now that the object kind of rotates and flattens out again. Alright, so there's a few different ways you can create keyframes. You can right click on a channel and hit key selected, or even key all if you like. You can press S to create a keyframe for all your unlocked channels, or once you've got at least one keyframe for your channels, you can turn on AutoKey, and you can then just move your object around at the frames that you want to create new positions for, like that. So the final little thing I want to show you guys is basically how to create keyframes for other attributes that are not sort of translate, rotate, or scale. I'm just going to empty out my timeline here. In order to highlight that, I'm just holding shift and dragging across the timeline, and you get this region. You can then right click and hit delete, and that'll basically delete any keyframes inside there. Okay, so what we're going to do here is open up the attribute panel, and I'm going to select my sphere, and you can see I've got my red shader here. What I'm going to do is just change the color over time. So the first thing I want to do is have my color set to red, maybe on frame 20, and I can come over to here to color, and I can right click and hit set key on color, and that creates a keyframe. Now you'll notice that it's added an input just here, okay, but there's no keyframe on the timeline. I'll just click on here and we'll take a look at that. You can see basically what it's done is added this this red color, which tells you the time and the value at a basic glance. Okay, So that's what that's doing. But note when you do this color keyframing, it doesn't add keyframes over here on the timeline. Then what I'll do is come across to frame, further up timeline, let's say frame 50, and I'll change the color. Now keep in mind that I've got the AutoKey still switched on, so we'll see if that actually works for this. So I'll just click on the color swatch and I'll change it to blue. Okay. Now if I scroll back to here, you can see that the auto keyframe tool has actually created a new keyframe, even though it's not indicating it here. And I can tell that it has because it's changing my object from red to blue as I scrub through the timeline. Now you can also interactively scrub through the timeline by holding down the K key and just left clicking and dragging inside the viewport. So I'm clicking and dragging up here above the sphere, but you can see that's when I'm holding K down, it's actually scrubbing through the timeline. So I can see the change over time of that animation. Okay, so the same thing goes for anything else in here. Basically, when you hover over one of the attributes, if you get this little menu cursor, you can right click and hit set key. So those are the basics for adding keyframes to attributes for your objects, which sort of is the foundation for the process of animating in 3D.